What would you do if the only thing standing between you and starvation was a single $10 bill, a threadbare shawl, and a piece of land that everyone in 3 counties had already given up on? For 19-year-old Anna Mercer, that was not a hypothetical question to turn over on a quiet evening. It was the exact shape of her life on a gray October morning in the high Colorado Rockies, when the wind carried the first true bite of winter and she stood at the edge of a dusty town square with nothing left to lose. She traded her last $10, every coin and bill she owned in the world, for ownership of 5 rocky acres and the crumbling bones of an abandoned army outpost so thoroughly forgotten that the auctioneer himself apologized for wasting the crowd's time on it. It was, by every measure the town could offer, a joke, a mercy sale to a girl too proud to beg and too desperate to walk away. But behind one sealed door on that condemned patch of ground sat a secret that had been hidden for a decade, a secret so valuable, so carefully buried by men with everything to lose, that uncovering it would not just save Anna Mercer's life. It would tear the mask off an entire town and hand an abandoned girl the one thing greed could never buy her back, a place to belong. Stay with us until the end, because what Anna found behind that door did not just change her fortune. It changed who got to call themselves free in that valley, and it started with a bitter wind, a folded bill, and a girl who had already lost everything twice. The town of Covenant Creek did not so much welcome the coming winter as brace against it, the way a wounded animal braces against a second blow. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet pine, of horse dung baking on cold cobblestones, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had lived there long enough, the sour tang of a place built on other people's misfortune. Anna Mercer knew that smell better than she knew her own name by now. It had seeped into her clothes, her hair, the very calluses on her palms, until she wondered sometimes if it would ever wash away, even if she lived to be an old woman somewhere far from these mountains. 6 months earlier, she had been someone else entirely, a girl with a mother who hummed while she kneaded bread dough and a father whose laugh could be heard clean across a hay field. Then the fever came, the way fevers do in mining towns, quietly at first, a cough here, a flushed cheek there, and within 3 weeks it had taken both of them, leaving Anna alone in a rented room with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a single crumpled $10 bill her father had pressed into her palm 2 days before he died. "Keep this for a real emergency, Annie," he had whispered, his voice already thin as paper. "Promise me." She had promised, and she had kept that promise through 6 months of hunger that would have broken most grown men, because some promises are the only inheritance a poor family has left to give. She had worked in the laundry first, elbow deep in lye soap and scalding water 12 hours a day, until the foreman decided her hands, chapped and cracking as they were less appealing to the customers than a younger girl's smile. She had swept the saloon floors at dawn before anyone was awake to be scandalized by a girl doing a man's work, until the owner's wife decided that was scandalous too. She had finally taken to sleeping in the livery stable, curled in the sweet hay beside animals who asked nothing of her and judged her for nothing, until even that small mercy was taken away. "Your presence is bad for business," the stable owner had told her, not unkindly but firmly, as though she were a stray dog that had simply overstayed a welcome she never truly had. And now, on this particular gray morning, she stood at the edge of the road leading out of Covenant Creek entirely, because Mayor Silas Croft himself, a stout man with small eyes and a voice like warm grease, had informed her with barely concealed satisfaction that the town charter held a clause against vagrancy, and that she, Anna Mercer, no longer qualified as a resident of anywhere. She was, in the plain cold language of the law, a problem that had overstayed its welcome. She had nodded because there was nothing else to do, and she had turned her face toward the county seat of Absolution, a name that struck her at the time as either a cruel joke or the last thin thread of a prayer. She walked for 2 days along a rutted, wind-scoured track that climbed steadily into thinner air and colder mornings. She ate the last heel of stale bread on the first day, and on the second she drank from streams so cold they numbed her lips, and each night she found a hollow among the pines, curled herself as small as she could manage, and let the ground draw the last of the day's warmth straight out of her bones. She was not merely hungry, though hunger gnawed at her constantly now, a low persistent ache she had almost grown used to. She was hollowed, scoured clean by grief and cold and the particular loneliness of being young and utterly unclaimed by anyone in the world. She thought often on those nights of her father's hands, broad and rough from years in the mine, but always gentle when they touched her hair or steadied her on a stumble. He had believed, with the stubborn faith of a man who had nothing else, that character was a kind of fortress no one could tax or foreclose or laugh away. She wondered, walking that frozen road, what he would think of his daughter now, drifting like a burr caught in the wind, belonging to no house and no town and no soul but her own tired self. When she finally limped into absolution on the afternoon of the second day, her feet blistered raw inside boots that had never quite fit, she was not drawn toward the church steeple or the sheriff's shingle, both of which promised only more forms to fill out and more doors to be turned away from. She was drawn instead, the way a moth is drawn toward the only light left burning, to a crowd gathered thick and restless in the town square, murmuring over a notice nailed crookedly to a post. County land auction, it read in blunt black letters. Delinquent properties. Seized assets. Cash only. She had no cash to speak of beyond the single folded bill still tucked deep in her pocket, and so she told herself she was only looking, only resting her eyes somewhere that was not the endless indifferent horizon, only borrowing a little human warmth from a crowd that did not know she was a ghost among them. The auctioneer was a wiry, fast-talking man in a hat gone dark with sweat, and he moved through the morning's lots with the practiced rhythm of a man who had sold off other people's ruined lives more times than he cared to count. A wagon went for $50 to a rancher who barely glanced at it. A prize bull fetched $110 after a brief flurry of competing bids. A promising quarter section with reliable water rights sparked a genuine contest between two prosperous-looking men in good coats, ending near $200 and a round of respectful applause. Anna watched it all from the back of the crowd, invisible in her faded calico, the figures being called out meaningless to a girl who could not have raised $2 if her life depended on it, which in a sense it did. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat, glanced down at his ledger, and something in his posture shifted, the particular loose-shouldered ease of a man about to sell something he privately considers worthless. "All right folks," he called out, "settle down now, we've got a unique opportunity here on Lot 73. By order of the county, we are offering the derelict structures and the surrounding 5 acres of the former United States Army outpost known as Fort Reprieve." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Anna saw a stout, florid-faced man near the front, a man she would soon learn was Silas Croft himself, the very mayor who had turned her out of Covenant Creek, lean toward his neighbor and murmur something that set the other man snorting into his sleeve. Now, the auctioneer chided, playing shamelessly to the laughter, "She's a fixer-upper, I'll grant you that much, but think of the history here, folks, think of the stone, think of the air." The laughter only grew. The fort, Anna gathered from the whispers around her, had been built a decade earlier to guard against some threat that had never materialized, abandoned within 2 years, a monument to wasted government money and wounded county pride, a local punchline more than a piece of property. "Who'll start the bidding?" the auctioneer pressed on gamely. "Let's say $20 for a piece of American history." Silence answered him, broken only by the wind kicking up small dust devils across the square. "All right then," he tried again, "a bargain, $10, do I hear $10 for 5 acres and a roof over your head, several roofs in fact, some assembly required." He winked at the crowd and the crowd chuckled dutifully along with him. And that was when something shifted inside Anna Mercer, quiet and sudden as a candle catching flame. A roof over her head. The words landed in her chest not as a joke but as something closer to a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She thought of the coming snow already dusting the peaks above the valley. She thought of the gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion. She thought of her father's $10, folded soft now from months in her pocket, meant for a real emergency, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she had never in her life faced a realer one. Her hand went up before her mind had fully caught up to the decision, thin and trembling but undeniable. "I have $10, she said, and her voice came out cracked and small, barely a croak, yet in the sudden lull it carried across the square like the report of a rifle. Every head turned. 100 pairs of eyes fixed themselves on the gaunt, wind-chapped girl standing alone at the back of the crowd, and for one long breath nobody moved at all. Then the silence broke into a burst of astonished laughter, and Silas Croft's face arranged itself into an expression that mixed pity with something colder, something closer to contempt. "The girl bids $10, the auctioneer called out, genuine surprise cracking through his practiced patter. "Do I hear 11? Do I hear 10.50? He scanned the crowd, but the crowd only stared, transfixed by the strange little drama unfolding in front of them. "Sold," he said at last, and the gavel came down with a crack that seemed to Anna louder than anything she had heard in months, to the young lady in the back for $10. A clerk pressed a folded deed into her hands, the paper still faintly warm from where it had sat in the sun, and it felt impossibly heavy for something so thin, a fool's burden dressed up as a fortune. But what, exactly, was she holding? Was it merely stone and rotted timber, a monument to failure that would swallow what little was left of her? Or was there something else waiting behind those crumbling walls, something the town's laughter had never bothered to look for? Was Fort Reprieve, as everyone around her seemed so certain, Nothing more than a tomb dressed up in an ironic name? Or could it, against every shred of evidence, somehow be a cradle instead? Keep watching, because the truth had been sealed behind a door no living soul in that square had dared to open in 10 long years, and Anna Mercer was about to become the first. The laughter followed Anna out of the square, and it was not entirely cruel, or at least not in the sharp deliberate way that true cruelty can be. It was the easy, thoughtless kind of laughter that belongs to people who have never once gone to bed hungry, the laughter of men and women with roofs already over their heads and food already waiting in their larders, who could not imagine that a girl clutching a joke of a deed might be walking toward the last real chance she had left on this earth. She held the folded paper against her chest like something fragile and made her way, out of habit more than hope, toward the largest building on the square, a well-stocked general store with the name Silas Croft painted in bold gilt letters above the door. Croft himself stood behind the counter polishing a set of brass scales when she stepped inside, and the smell of sawdust and pickling spice and coffee beans wrapped around her like a memory of a life she no longer had. He looked up, recognized her instantly from the auction, and something like delighted contempt settled over his round face. "Well, well," he said, drawing the words out slow, "if it isn't the great land baroness herself, come to provision her new estate." Anna did not rise to the bait. Her list, when she finally spoke it, was painfully short. "A sack of flour, please, some dried beans and a box of matches if you'd be so kind." The auctioneer was a wiry, fast-talking man in a hat gone dark with sweat, and he moved through the morning's lots with the practiced rhythm of a man who had sold off other people's ruined lives more times than he cared to count. A wagon went for $50 to a rancher who barely glanced at it. A prize bull fetched $110 after a brief flurry of competing bids. A promising quarter section with reliable water rights sparked a genuine contest between two prosperous-looking men in good coats, ending near $200 and a round of respectful applause. Anna watched it all from the back of the crowd, invisible in her faded calico, the figures being called out meaningless to a girl who could not have raised $2 if her life depended on it, which in a sense it did. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat, glanced down at his ledger, and something in his posture shifted, the particular loose-shouldered ease of a man about to sell something he privately considers worthless. "All right, folks," he called out, "settle down now, we've got a unique opportunity here on Lot 73. By order of the county, we are offering the derelict structures and the surrounding 5 acres of the former United States Army outpost known as Fort Reprieve." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Anna saw a stout, florid-faced man near the front, a man she would soon learn was Silas Croft himself, the very mayor who had turned her out of Covenant Creek, lean toward his neighbor and murmur something that set the other man snorting into his sleeve. Now, the auctioneer chided, playing shamelessly to the laughter, "She's a fixer-upper, I'll grant you that much, but think of the history here, folks, think of the stone, think of the air." The laughter only grew. The fort, Anna gathered from the whispers around her, had been built a decade earlier to guard against some threat that had never materialized, abandoned within 2 years, a monument to wasted government money and wounded county pride, a local punchline more than a piece of property. "Who'll start the bidding?" the auctioneer pressed on gamely. "Let's say $20 for a piece of American history." Silence answered him, broken only by the wind kicking up small dust devils across the square. "All right then," he tried again, "a bargain, $10, do I hear $10 for 5 acres and a roof over your head, several roofs in fact, some assembly required." He winked at the crowd and the crowd chuckled dutifully along with him. And that was when something shifted inside Anna Mercer, quiet and sudden as a candle catching flame. A roof over her head. The words landed in her chest not as a joke but as something closer to a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She thought of the coming snow already dusting the peaks above the valley. She thought of the gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion. She thought of her father's $10, folded soft now for months in her pocket, meant for a real emergency, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she had never in her life faced a realer one. Her hand went up before her mind had fully caught up to the decision, thin and trembling but undeniable. "I have $10, she said, and her voice came out cracked and small, barely a croak, yet in the sudden lull it carried across the square like the report of a rifle. Every head turned. 100 pairs of eyes fixed themselves on the gaunt, wind-chapped girl standing alone at the back of the crowd, and for one long breath nobody moved at all. Then the silence broke into a burst of astonished laughter, and Silas Croft's face arranged itself into an expression that mixed pity with something colder, something closer to contempt. "The girl bids $10, the auctioneer called out, genuine surprise cracking through his practiced patter. "Do I hear 11? Do I hear 10.50? He scanned the crowd, but the crowd only stared, transfixed by the strange little drama unfolding in front of them. "Sold," he said at last, and the gavel came down with a crack that seemed to Anna louder than anything she had heard in months, to the young lady in the back for $10. A clerk pressed a folded deed into her hands, the paper still faintly warm from where it had sat in the sun, and it felt impossibly heavy for something so thin, a fool's burden dressed up as a fortune. But what, exactly, was she holding? Was it merely stone and rotted timber, a monument to failure that would swallow what little was left of her? Or was there something else waiting behind those crumbling walls, something the town's laughter had never bothered to look for? Was Fort Reprieve, as everyone around her seemed so certain, nothing more than a tomb dressed up in an ironic name? Or could it, against every shred of evidence, somehow be a cradle instead? Keep watching, because the truth had been sealed behind a door no living soul in that square had dared to open in 10 long years, and Anna Mercer was about to become the first. The laughter followed Anna out of the square, and it was not entirely cruel, or at least not in the sharp, deliberate way that true cruelty can be. It was the easy, thoughtless kind of laughter that belongs to people who have never once gone to bed hungry, the laughter of men and women with roofs already over their heads and food already waiting in their larders, who could not imagine that a girl clutching a joke of a deed might be walking toward the last real chance she had left on this earth. She held the folded paper against her chest like something fragile and made her way, out of habit more than hope, toward the largest building on the square, a well-stocked general store with the name Silas Croft painted in bold gilt letters above the door. Croft himself stood behind the counter polishing a set of brass scales when she stepped inside, and the smell of sawdust and pickling spice and coffee beans wrapped around her like a memory of a life she no longer had. He looked up, recognized her instantly from the auction, and something like delighted contempt settled over his round face. "Well, well," he said, drawing the words out slow, "if it isn't the great land baroness herself, come to provision her new estate." Anna did not rise to the bait. Her list, when she finally spoke it, was painfully short. "A sack of flour, please, some dried beans and a box of matches if you'd be so kind." Croft did not move to fetch a single item. "Cash on the barrel head, little missy," he said instead, leaning his forearms on the counter, "and my prices have gone up considerable. Hard winter coming, you understand, supply and demand being what it is." The figure he named was nearly 3 times what any honest merchant in the territory would have charged, and Anna felt her stomach drop straight through the floorboards. "I have no money left," she admitted, the words scraping her throat raw with shame. "But I have a deed to 5 acres now. I could work it off. I'm not afraid of work." Croft threw his head back and laughed, a booming sound that made her flinch as though struck. "Work," he repeated, wiping his eyes. "Honey, a strong gust off those mountains would blow you clean into next county. And that deed of yours isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Fort Reprieve is a graveyard, plain and simple, always has been. You'll be haunting it your own self by Christmas, mark me. Now get on out of my store. I don't run a charity for beggars and squatters." Shame burned hot across Anna's cheeks as she backed toward the door, and the handful of other customers in the store found sudden fascinating interest in the floorboards or the shelves, their silence its own small betrayal. She stood on the wooden sidewalk a moment later, blinking against the harsh autumn light, and felt despair settle over her like a second, heavier coat. She owned land now, yes, land and stone and the promise of a roof, but she would starve on it just as surely as she would have starved in the street. She was trapped inside her own strange victory. She had gone perhaps 20 paces, already turning her thoughts toward whatever direction might lead her furthest from absolution's judgment, when a voice, dry and papery as autumn leaves scraping across a porch, stopped her cold. "That paper you're carrying," the voice said. "It's a heavy thing to hold on to all by yourself." Anna turned and found an old woman rocking gently in a chair on the porch of a small neat cabin at the very edge of town, a shawl the color of dust drawn around her thin shoulders, her face a road map of 100 hard winters, her eyes dark and startlingly alert. Anna could not have said afterward why she crossed the yard and held out the deed for the old woman's inspection, only that something in that raspy voice had asked to be trusted. The old woman did not so much as glance at the legal script scrawled across the page. She looked instead at the 2 words printed at the top, Fort Reprieve, and something like recognition or perhaps old sorrow, moved behind her eyes. "Some walls," she said slowly, her gaze drifting toward the distant blue line of mountains, "are built to keep people out. And some are built to keep secrets in. The trick of it, child, the whole trick of it, is learning which ones were meant all along to give." Anna waited for more, some explanation, some key to unlock the riddle, but the old woman only rocked, her eyes closed now, as though the effort of speaking at all had cost her something dear. Anna thanked her, though for what exactly she could not have said, and turned once more toward the road out of town, the the strange words settling into her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she would not understand for weeks yet. It was then, as she passed the edge of the loading yard with her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of the town's judgment, that a man's voice called out to her, plain and unhurried. "Ma'am, that your deed to the old fort?" She turned expecting another jab, another round of laughter dressed up as concern, and found instead a tall, lean man in his late 30s loading burlap sacks onto the bed of a heavy freight wagon, his face weathered deep by sun and wind, his eyes carrying a particular sadness she recognized because she saw its twin in the mirror each morning. "It is," she said cautiously. He simply nodded, wiping calloused hands on his trousers. "Robert Hask," he offered. "I'm headed out that direction myself, hauling supplies up past the ridge. Happy to carry you a few miles if it'd help." He did not laugh. He did not offer pity dressed up as kindness the way so many others had. He simply made a plain, practical offer, and the sheer unexpected decency of it very nearly broke through the careful wall Anna had built around her own grief these past months. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick. As he helped her up onto the wagon seat beside him, his eyes flicked briefly over her thin frame, her worn-out boots, and something in his jaw tightened, though he said nothing about it directly. "There's a man just past the western turnoff," he said instead, eyes fixed on the road ahead as the wagon lurched into motion. "Jedediah breeds mules for a living, good honest sort. Tell him I sent you. He'll see you right on a steady animal, fair price, no tricks. You'll need something to help carry your things up to the fort." Anna did not tell him she had no things left to carry. She only nodded and let the town of Absolution, with its whispers and its croft and its cruel little jokes, fall away slowly behind them. The journey that followed was, in its own quiet way, a lesson in both distance and unexpected mercy. Robert dropped her at the turnoff with a small parcel of bread and hard cheese pressed into her hands before she could refuse it, and she walked the remaining 5 miles alone to Jedediah's modest mule farm, where the old man, upon hearing Robert Hask's name spoken, sold her a placid, sway-backed but sturdy mule in exchange for 2 days' promised labor mucking out his barn come spring. She named the mule Pilgrim because they were, both of them, wanderers thrown together on a road neither had chosen. The next morning, with Pilgrim carrying what little she had managed to gather, Anna set out at last for Fort Reprieve. The path climbed steadily, narrowing from a wagon track into little more than a game trail winding up through stands of lodgepole pine into thinner, cleaner air. The world around her seemed to hold its breath as she climbed, the pines standing like silent sentries on either side, their scent sharp and resinous in the cold. It was a hard, unforgiving beauty, the kind that made a person feel very small and very temporary, and yet there was something almost freeing in that smallness, in the thought that a world this vast and indifferent might, somewhere within it, have room enough for one more forgotten girl. She arrived just as dusk was settling over the valley, that particular hush of an hour when the whole world seems to hold perfectly still. The sun had already dropped behind the western ridge, staining the sky in violent streaks of orange bleeding into deep bruised purple, and there finally stood Fort Reprieve. It was worse, far worse than anything she had allowed herself to imagine. A low stone wall, breached and crumbling in half a dozen places, enclosed a square of desolate weed-choked ground. 2 of the 4 original buildings had long since collapsed into heaps of rotted timber and scattered stone. A third, likely once a command post, still stood after a fashion, though its roof sagged in the middle like the broken back of some great tired animal. The 4th building, set apart from the others near the eastern wall, stood intact and silent, its door shut fast against whatever secrets it held. The main gate, iron-strapped wood hanging from a single stubborn hinge, groaned and shuddered in the rising wind like something in pain. Pilgrim balked at the broken gate, ears twitching, and refused outright to go a single step further, and for one long terrible moment Anna's own courage faltered right along with him. This was not a reprieve of any kind. This looked, in the fading light, very much like a sentence. But she thought of Croft's mocking laughter, of the old woman's cryptic words about walls built to give, of her father's rough gentle hands that had never once backed down from hard labor, and she slid down off Pilgrim's back, tied him to a sturdy scrub oak just outside the wall, and walked through the broken gate alone, her boots crunching over fallen stone into whatever waited for her on the other side. She could not bring herself, that first evening, to try the door of the one intact building, the small stone structure set apart from the rest. Something about its silence felt too final, too heavy with whatever it held, and she was too exhausted, too hollowed out by 2 days of walking and months of grief, to face spiders and rot and darkness on top of everything else. Instead she found a sheltered corner along the inside of the main wall where the stone broke the worst of the wind, untied her thin bedroll from Pilgrim's back, and laid it over the cold ground. She ate the last of Robert's bread and cheese slowly, savoring each bite the way a person savors something they are not certain will come again, and washed it down with water gone icy from her canteen. She sat afterward with her back pressed against the cold stone and watched the stars begin to emerge overhead, one by one and then in great scattered handfuls, brilliant and impossibly close in the thin mountain air. A canopy of cold fire stretched from ridge to ridge. There was no sound at all beyond the wind moving through broken timbers and the soft contented munching of Pilgrim nearby, and the silence pressed against her like something almost physical, the silence of a place the world had simply agreed long ago to forget. That night Anna Mercer, owner now of 5 acres and a ruin, slept beneath the open sky, a trespasser on her own land, and dreamed in fragments of walls, some collapsing into dust and others somehow, against all reason, holding fast. Morning came pale and watery over the eastern peaks, and in its unforgiving light the fort looked, if anything, even more pitiful than it had at dusk. Weeds choked every corner of the compound. The bleached bones of some long-dead animal lay scattered near the mouth of the old well. For one long moment despair rose in Anna's chest so sharply it nearly buckled her knees, and Silas Croft's mocking voice echoed unbidden through her mind, a graveyard plain and simple. But then she looked down at her own hands, scraped raw and dirty as they were, and saw in them her father's hands, capable, strong, unafraid of hard labor no matter how the world sneered at it. He had never once backed away from a difficult thing simply because it was difficult. Neither, she decided then and there, standing alone in the ruin of a fort nobody wanted, would she. She began with the only thing within her power to control, which was the chaos itself. She spent that first full day clearing debris from the central courtyard, piling loose stone in one corner and rotted timber in another, mindless back-breaking labor that nonetheless felt, for the first time in half a year, like an answer to the emptiness rather than a surrender to it. By afternoon her palms were blistered raw and her back ached in ways she had not known a body could ache, and still she kept working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking just then was more than she could bear. By the second day she turned her attention to the one standing barracks, the building with the sagging broken-backed roof, reasoning correctly that she would need real shelter, and soon, before the snows came down off the peaks in earnest. The door had swollen fast in its frame, stubborn as an old grudge, and she had to wedge a length of fallen timber into the gap and throw her whole slight weight against it before it finally gave way with a long groaning shriek of protesting wood. The inside was musty and thick with cobwebs, dark even at midday, but blessedly, wonderfully dry. And as she began the slow work of clearing out a decade's accumulated filth, she started noticing things, small details that did not fit the story the town told about this place. The fireplaces built into the corners were not the cramped, purely functional boxes typical of any ordinary army barracks she had ever heard described. They were large, deep, clearly designed by someone who had intended them to throw serious, sustained heat through a long mountain winter. The window openings, though their glass had long since vanished, were positioned with real care to catch the low angle of the morning sun. This had not been built merely as a military outpost meant to house soldiers for a season or two and then be abandoned. It felt, in some way she could not fully articulate, protective. Almost gentle in its bones, as though whoever had drawn up these plans had been thinking not of strategy or defense but of keeping people warm and safe through hard, dangerous months. Her explorations, room by room, eventually led her back to the fourth building, the one she had avoided that first frightened night. Up close, in the honest light of day, she could see it was built of the same sturdy stone as the barracks, but its single door was entirely different in character. It was thick oak, banded heavily with iron, and it was not merely locked in any ordinary sense. A series of heavy iron bolts had been driven straight through the door and into the surrounding stone frame, their ends hammered flat and cold against the wood so that no key, no matter how cleverly turned, could ever have opened it again. And at the very center, precisely where an ordinary lock would sit, was pressed a small circular seal of lead, stamped deep with an intricate design she did not recognize, an eagle clutching not the expected crossed arrows of a military crest but something else entirely, a key laid crosswise against a set of scales. This was not a door that anyone had ever intended to open again. It had been sealed, deliberately and with real effort, permanently shut. A chill moved down Anna's spine that had nothing whatsoever to do with the thin mountain air. Why, she wondered, standing there with her hand hovering just short of the cold iron, would anyone go to such extraordinary trouble to seal an empty building? Soldiers abandoning a post in haste would simply have locked the door, or more likely left it standing open behind them, in too great a hurry to care one way or the other. This was something else entirely. This had been deliberate. This had been hiding something and hiding it well. As if in answer to the unease already tightening in her chest, Pilgrim, who had been trailing after her about the compound with the placid curiosity of an animal who trusted his new owner, stopped short a full 20 feet from the sealed building. He lowered his head, sniffed twice at the air, and let out a low, deeply unhappy bray before backing several steps away, ears pinned flat against his skull. He would come no closer, no matter how gently Anna coaxed him. The animal's plain instinct only confirmed the growing suspicion already taking root in her own mind, that something was deeply wrong with that building, and that whatever it was, it very likely had everything to do with why a 5-acre fort with a standing structure and clean well water had sold, in front of an entire town, for exactly $10 and not 1 cent more. The days that followed bled slowly into weeks, marked by the gradual turning of the aspen leaves along the ridge from summer green into brilliant, trembling gold. Anna worked from the moment the sun cleared the eastern peaks until it dropped again behind the western ridge, and the hard, honest labor became a kind of balm, quieting the restless grief that had followed her every waking hour since her parents died. She patched the sagging roof of the barracks with scavenged timber and hand-mixed mud, her palms slowly learning the unfamiliar rhythms of mortar and stone. She cleared the choked well of a decade's fallen debris and was rewarded, on the third exhausting day of digging, with a clean gurgle of fresh water rising from some deep-hidden spring beneath the mountain itself, cold and sweet and utterly uncontaminated. Bit by bit, the fort seemed to yield its secrets to her, and each one deepened the same quiet mystery. Hidden culverts, half buried under years of dirt and pine needles, drained water carefully away from the foundations before it could rot the timbers. The main buildings themselves had been angled, she realized one blustery afternoon while watching dust swirl unpredictably across the courtyard, specifically to break the worst of the prevailing winter wind before it could reach the doors. This had not been the half-hearted work of disinterested soldiers marking time until their next posting. This had been the work of someone who had planned, carefully and at real cost, to stay through hard winters for a very long time indeed. One afternoon, as Anna knelt in the courtyard trying to fashion a crude window covering out of a scrap of old canvas, the distant creak and rattle of wagon wheels made her look up sharply. It was Robert Hask, his freight wagon loaded now with salvaged lumber and a battered crate of tools, and as he pulled the team to a stop just outside the broken gate, his gaze moved slowly over the cleared courtyard, the freshly patched roof, the thin curl of wood smoke rising steady from the barracks chimney. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. "Looks like you've been busy," he said simply, climbing down without waiting to be invited. "Had some extra lumber lying around," he added, by way of an explanation nobody had actually asked him for, and began unloading it without another word. For the next 2 days he stayed on, and together they worked the kind of comfortable, wordless labor that asks nothing of two people beyond their shared effort. He taught her how to draw a saw properly through green wood without binding the blade, how to measure twice before ever cutting once, how to mix a mortar with just enough lime to hold firm against the coming frost. They spoke little as they worked, and the silence between them was never awkward, only companionable, filled instead with the steady rhythm of hammers and the scrape of stone against stone. He told her, in pieces offered across those 2 quiet days, that he had once ridden as a cavalry scout in his younger years, and that his wife had been carried off by the very same fever that had swept through Covenant Creek and taken Anna's own parents. There was a shared geography of loss between them that required no further explanation, the kind two people simply recognize in each other without needing to trade the particulars. Before he left on the 3rd morning, Anna finally led him to the sealed armory, curious whether his years of army service might make some sense of what she had found. He ran a calloused hand slowly over the thick oak door, his fingers tracing the cold iron bands, and when he leaned in close to study the lead seal pressed at its center, his brow furrowed deep in concentration. "That's not a standard army seal," he murmured, half to himself. "I've seen hundreds of them over the years, out west and back east both. They're always the eagle and crossed arrows, every single time, no exceptions I ever came across. This is something else entirely." He leaned closer still, eyes narrowing at the small worn image of the key laid across the scale. "That's a quartermaster's private seal," he said finally, straightening up, "from the Department of the Interior, if I'm not mistaken. They use marks like that for bonded goods, things placed under special federal protection. Relief supplies sometimes. Government payrolls." He turned to look at her directly, his expression suddenly, unmistakably serious. "Whatever's behind this door, Anna, it wasn't just locked up and forgotten. It was placed under federal protection, and somebody went to a great deal of trouble afterward to make it look like nothing more than another abandoned building nobody would ever bother to open. The first snow came early that year, a fine dusting of white powder that traced the outline of every stone and bare branch in the compound, and the sight of it sent a fresh current of urgency straight through Anna's chest. Her patched roof and canvas-covered windows would see her through the winter well enough, she believed, but the mystery of that sealed armory had settled into her like a splinter she could not stop worrying at. Robert's words had planted something in her that would not let her rest, relief supplies, and she found herself thinking again and again of the hungry, hollow-eyed families she had glimpsed on the road to absolution, of children in threadbare coats, of what it might mean if the key to their survival, and her own, sat locked behind a door nobody in this valley had dared to open in 10 long years. When Robert returned on his next supply run some days later, she was ready. "I have to get it open," she told him, her voice steadier now than it had been in months, and he simply nodded, understanding without needing further explanation, and set down the sacks he'd been carrying to help her. It took the better part of a full day. They used a long, heavy length of pine as a crude battering ram, swinging it together in a steady, punishing rhythm against the ancient oak, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks like some strange, determined drumbeat. The wood held stubbornly at first, splinters flying with every impact, the iron bands groaning in protest, but slowly one bolt gave way and then a second, and finally, with one last coordinated heave that left them both gasping, the door burst inward and crashed flat against the stone floor in a cloud of disturbed dust. A gust of stale, bitterly cold air rushed out to meet them, carrying with it the scent of dry wool, old cedar, and undisturbed years. They lit a lantern between them and stepped inside together, and Anna found herself holding her breath, half-braced to find gun racks or powder barrels or some other grim military remnant. What she found instead was, in its own quiet way, far more valuable than any weapon could ever have been. Stacked neatly from the stone floor almost to the ceiling stood row upon row of wooden crates, every single one stenciled with the same official marking, United States Department of the Interior, Valley Relief. Her hands trembling with an emotion she could not fully name, Anna took a crowbar to the nearest crate and pried the lid free. Inside, nestled carefully in clean straw, lay dozens of thick gray wool army blankets, perfectly preserved despite the passing decade. They pried open a second crate and found sturdy men's work boots in a range of sizes, still stiff with newness. A third held tins of good coffee, sacks of fine white flour, and barrels of salted pork packed tight in brine. A fourth, when they finally worked the lid free, revealed medical supplies of every description, jars of laudanum, rolls of clean and used bandages, bottles of carbolic acid, and a set of surgical instruments still wrapped in oiled cloth. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a treasure, and more than that, it was the precise difference between a hard winter survived and a hard winter that ended in a row of fresh graves for half the valley. They worked their way slowly toward the rear of the armory, their lantern throwing long dancing shadows across the walls, and there, on a small dust-covered desk pushed into the farthest corner, sat a heavy iron lockbox, its latch strangely left unfastened. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to guard against the damp, they found several leather-bound ledgers. Anna opened the topmost one with careful, reverent fingers. The very first page laid out a full accounting of every item stored within the armory, signed at the bottom by a Captain James T. Holloway, Quartermaster Corps, and dated exactly 10 years prior. The manifest stated plainly that the goods were intended for immediate distribution to homesteaders and struggling miners throughout the region, following what the document referred to only as the brutal winter of the previous year. The pages that followed were distribution logs, page after careful page listing the names of local families across the valley, families Anna half recognized from her time in Covenant Creek and Absolution both. But the columns meant to record what each family had actually received sat entirely, damningly blank, every single one of them all the way to the final page. And at the bottom of each blank page, nonetheless, sat a signature attesting formally that the listed supplies had indeed been received and properly accounted for. The signature, bold and crisp even after 10 years, was chillingly, unmistakably familiar. Silas Croft, Chairman, Absolution Town Council. These supplies had never been lost in some flood, as the old stories claimed. They had been hidden deliberately and with great care, by a man who had built his entire fortune and every ounce of his standing in this valley on the suffering of neighbors he had sworn, in writing, to help. Word of a miracle at the old fort traveled faster than any rider could have carried it, spreading through the valley the way a spark spreads through dry winter grass. It started, as these things often do, with a single kindness. Anna had given one of the thick wool blankets to a young trapper boy she found checking his lines near the edge of her property, his own coat gone thin and threadbare with wear. The boy, warm perhaps for the first time in months, went straight to Croft's store to buy ammunition, and being young and full of wonder, he talked. He spoke of the girl living up at the old fort and the room full of crates he had only heard whispered about, and word moved from ear to ear until it reached the one man in the valley who understood exactly what it meant. The color drained clean out of Silas Croft's face the moment he heard. He knew immediately, without needing a single further detail, precisely what had been found and precisely what it would cost him. His secret, the very foundation beneath a decade of wealth and standing in quiet, comfortable power, was out in the open now, and there would be no putting it back behind a sealed door. He did not hesitate. He gathered 3 men from the saloon, men whose loyalty ran only as deep as the coin he paid them, and rode hard for the fort, their horses kicking up great plumes of new snow behind them as they climbed. They arrived in a swirl of dust and fury, and Croft dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face twisted into a mask of righteous outrage that did not quite manage to hide the fear underneath it. "You," he bellowed, jabbing a thick finger at Anna as she stepped out to meet them. "You are a thief and a common squatter girl. This is town property, every last crate of it, and it belongs by rights to the Absolution Council." Robert Hask stepped out of the barracks behind her and came to stand at her side, one hand resting easy but deliberate on the handle of the axe he had been splitting wood with only minutes before. He said nothing at all, but his presence alone was answer enough to Croft's bluster. "This is federal property, Croft," Anna said, and though her voice shook slightly with the effort, it carried clear and steady across the yard. "And you are the one who stole it. It is all written plain in the ledgers, every page of it in your own hand and your own signature." Croft's eyes widened for one unguarded instant before narrowing again into something far more dangerous. "Ledgers," he snarled. "I'll show you ledgers." He motioned to his men, who began swinging down from their saddles, hands drifting suggestively close to the pistols riding on their hips, and for one long, terrible moment the cold still air of the courtyard seemed to hang suspended around a spark that might, at any second, catch fire. And then, as though the mountains themselves had chosen that exact moment to intervene, the world went white. The wind, which had been little more than a whisper all morning, rose in an instant to a full-throated scream, and the gray overcast sky above them tore open and unleashed a blinding torrent of snow. It was the blizzard the old-timers down in the valley had been muttering about for weeks, arriving now with sudden, staggering force. Visibility dropped in a matter of seconds to no more than 10 feet in any direction, and the temperature seemed to plummet right along with it. Croft and his men found themselves facing a choice with no good answer: press forward into an armed confrontation in the teeth of a killer storm, or turn tail for the safety of town while there was still any chance of finding the road at all. Cursing loudly enough to be heard over the rising gale, Croft chose retreat. "This isn't over, girl," he screamed back over his shoulder as he swung up onto his horse. "When this storm breaks, I'm coming back with the sheriff himself, and a proper warrant besides." And then he and his men vanished entirely into the churning white, swallowed whole by the storm. The immediate danger had passed, but a far larger one had settled over the valley in its place. The blizzard raged without mercy for 3 full days, piling the snow into great sculpted drifts that buried the landscape and isolated the fort completely from the outside world. Yet Croft, it would turn out, had been badly mistaken about one crucial thing. Fort Reprieve was no longer any kind of graveyard. It had become, almost overnight, a beacon. On the second day of the storm, a faint desperate cry carried to them on the shrieking wind, and Robert and Anna, bundled thick against the cold, followed the sound through near blinding snow until they found a family of miners, the Hudsons, huddled together where their shack had finally collapsed beneath the sheer weight of accumulated snow. Their youngest child burned hot with fever in his mother's arms. Anna did not hesitate for even a moment. She led them straight into the warm, dry barracks, wrapped the sick child in one of the thick wool blankets pulled fresh from the armory, and pressed hot coffee and bread into the exhausted parents' shaking hands. They were only the first. By the third day, 2 more families had struggled through the deep drifts, drawn by the almost impossible rumor of a warm, safe place still standing up near the old ruined fort, families the rest of the valley had long since written off as forgotten. Anna welcomed every single one of them without hesitation, opening crate after crate, distributing blankets and food and medicine that had sat locked away and useless for 10 wasted years, finally, at long last, put to the exact purpose for which they had first been sent. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, the entire world lay transformed beneath a thick, pristine blanket of snow that muffled every sound into a strange, holy silence. The sky overhead had turned a brilliant, aching blue, sharp as new glass. But the quiet at Fort Reprieve did not last long, because it was soon broken by the sound of voices, a baby's thin cry, the steady rhythmic chop of an axe splitting wood. It was, unmistakably, the sound of a community taking shape where only ruins had stood a season before. True to his furious word, Croft returned the moment the roads were passable again, this time bringing with him the county sheriff, a weary heavy-set man named Miller, along with a small posse of his own paid men. But when they finally rode through the broken gate, they did not find a lone, frightened girl standing alone against them. They found a full dozen men arrayed in front of the barracks, the fathers and husbands of the very families Anna had taken in through the storm, and though they carried no firearms among them, only axes and shovels, there was a quiet, unshakable resolve in the way they stood shoulder to shoulder that made even Croft's hired men think twice about their footing. "Anna Mercer," the sheriff said at last, his voice heavy with a tiredness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. "Mr. Croft here has filed a formal complaint, claims you've made off with property belonging rightfully to the town of Absolution." Before Anna could even open her mouth to answer, Robert Hask stepped forward, the heavy quartermaster's ledger held out steady in both hands. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "before you go and do anything hasty, I'd strongly suggest you take a look at this first." Miller took the book with obvious reluctance, and as his eyes moved down the first page, his expression shifted slowly from weary irritation into something closer to genuine astonishment. It was at that exact moment that another sleigh came into view along the fresh cleared track, this one carrying a well-dressed man in a fine wool coat, Circuit Judge Morrison, who had been stranded in Absolution these past several days by the very same storm, and whose curiosity, once the rumors reached him, had proven simply too strong to resist. He was known throughout the territory as a fair, exacting man whose word carried the full weight of the law in places far too remote for regular courts to reach. He took the ledger from Miller's outstretched hand without a word and examined it in silence for a long, uncomfortable stretch, studying the careful signatures, the official government seal pressed clean into the leather cover, before walking slowly over to the armory itself to inspect the stenciled crates with his own eyes. When he finally returned to the courtyard, his face had gone grim as granite. "Mr. Croft," he said, and his voice carried the particular ringing authority of a man who has spent decades being obeyed the moment he speaks. "This ledger, and every crate inside that building, constitutes federal property, plain and simple. The seal alone confirms as much beyond any reasonable argument. Your own signature, appearing here on page after page, attesting falsely that these goods were properly distributed when they were in fact deliberately hoarded away for a full decade, constitutes fraud, Mr. Croft, fraud committed directly against the government of the United States." A sharp gasp moved through the small assembled crowd, and Croft himself turned the color of old ash, his mouth working uselessly for several seconds before any sound came out at all. "I hereby place these relief supplies under the direct stewardship of Miss Anna Mercer," the judge continued, his voice carrying clean across the snow-muffled courtyard, "for immediate and fair distribution among the needy families of this region, precisely as was their original intent 10 years ago." It was not, in the end, a loud or triumphant sort of vindication. It arrived instead as something quieter and in its own way far more powerful, a slow current that seemed to shift the very ground beneath everyone's feet all at once. The same townspeople who had ridden out that morning with Croft's posse, the same men and women who had laughed her out of the town square only weeks before, now looked at Anna Mercer with an expression she had never once seen directed her way in her entire 19 years, something close to genuine awe. They saw the warm, well-patched barracks. They saw healthy children playing in the snow where sick ones had arrived half-frozen only days earlier. They saw neat, organized piles of supplies waiting to be carried down into the valley to families who had gone without for far too long. They did not see a squatter standing before them any longer. They saw, whether they had words for it yet or not, a leader. Silas Croft, stripped bare of his standing and exposed as a fraud in front of the very neighbors he had swindled for a decade, stood entirely alone at the edge of the courtyard, his whole carefully built empire of quiet greed melting away as surely and as finally as the snow around his boots. Spring came slowly to the high valley that year, a gentle, unhurried miracle of green pushing up through soil that had spent a long hard winter buried under white. The snow receded a little more with each passing week, revealing dark, rich earth beneath, and up at Fort Reprieve the change proved more profound still. The fort was no longer any kind of ruin. It had become, in every sense that mattered, a home. The families Anna had sheltered through that first terrible storm had chosen, one and all, to stay on through the spring and beyond. Together they repaired the 2 remaining collapsed barracks, cleared fresh ground for a shared communal garden right in the heart of the old courtyard, and the steady rhythm of hammers and saws slowly replaced what had once been only the mournful whistle of wind through empty stone. Children's laughter rang out now in places where for 10 long years, there had been nothing but silence and slow decay. Nobody called it Anna's folly anymore, not even in jest. They simply, quietly began calling it the Reprieve. Anna herself was no longer any kind of outcast drifting at the edges of other people's lives. She had become, almost without noticing the transition happen, the true heart of this small growing community. She organized the fair distribution of the last remaining supplies, made certain every single family had what they needed to start fresh. She settled small disputes between neighbors with the same patient fairness her father had once shown her. She planned the spring planting alongside the other women, and in the evenings, by lamplight, she taught the youngest children their letters at a long table Robert had built from salvaged barracks timber. She had found at last the one thing she had been searching for through every mile of that long cold walk out of Covenant Creek, a real and lasting purpose. She was no longer a ghost drifting through other people's stories. She had become instead an anchor for an entire valley. One evening, as the sun began its slow golden descent behind the western ridge, painting long warm light across the busy courtyard below, Anna and Robert stood together on the newly repaired stone wall, looking down at the small thriving life they had helped bring into being. Below them, Pilgrim grazed contentedly in the new spring grass. The scent of wood smoke and fresh baked bread drifted up on the evening air. Robert, who had remained a steady, quiet presence at her side through the entire long hard winter, reached over and took her hand in his palm rough and calloused just like her father's had been, though the gesture itself was gentle, full of some unspoken understanding neither of them needed to put into words. It did not feel, in that moment, like the beginning of something new so much as the quiet continuation of something that had already, somewhere along that long cold road, taken root. Looking back on it all, Robert asked softly, his eyes still fixed on the bustling courtyard below, "What exactly did you think you were buying that day for $10? Anna was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over carefully in her mind. She thought of the desperate, hollowed-out girl she had been that morning in the town square, of the families now settled safely below, of the gardens just beginning to take shape, of the sturdy patched roofs and the warm lights glowing in every window as evening settled over the valley. She felt the solid, steady warmth of Robert's hand wrapped around her own. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first truly easy smile she had allowed herself in what felt like an entire lifetime. "I thought I was only buying a roof," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "But I think, in the end, what I actually bought was a foundation." And perhaps that is the truest lesson buried inside Anna Mercer's story, that the world will often tell you exactly what something is worth, will laugh you out of a town square and call your last hope a graveyard, and the world will very often be wrong. Sometimes the most valuable thing a person can own is not handed down or inherited or bought at a fair price by someone who already has everything. Sometimes it is picked up for $10 desperate by someone with nothing left to lose, sealed behind a door nobody else was brave enough or hungry enough to open, waiting patiently through 10 long-forgotten years for exactly the right person to finally come looking. If Anna's story moved you even a little, stay close because there are more stories like hers still waiting to be told, stories about the quiet, unglamorous courage it takes to build a home out of nothing at all, and the strange, patient justice of a world that has a way, in the end, of returning to people exactly what they never stopped deserving.